This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien starts off the show with his grain market update as he explains how growers might be seeing the positive side of uncertainty in the market. Tina Sullivan, K-State Extension agronomist, keeps the show rolling as she details how the wet conditions in parts of the state could be impacting corn and soybean production. Wrapping up the show is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond as he notes the recent cool and wet conditions and what is in the forecast. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with the grain market update from K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. Daniel, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
Daniel, as we're looking at the grain market, as always, what are we seeing for futures?
Well, the futures markets have been volatile this week with freeze scare that was driving up hard red winter wheat futures had jumped to the higher side this week. We'll talk about that here in a minute, just how high. But then they actually had evidence of some freeze, more so to the west and actually more so in eastern Colorado probably than here. But preliminary ideas are that the antifreeze that came from this event was more limited than maybe had been feared coming in. So we'll let our agronomist at KSU, after observations for some period of time to be sure, give the final proclamation. But on the one hand, you've got the ongoing resilience of the Kansas wheat crop that we recognize, and tough to kill this stuff, but also some earlier freeze damage, some dry areas, etc. I think the general consensus is that, and the market's pricing that we won't have as much quantity of crop this year as we've had in the past. Just a matter of how much these different events come in and reduce production. So with that, we closed on Thursday for wheat, hard red winter wheat, down in the July contract, down 19, almost 20 cents, down to 667 and a quarter. So again, we were up at 687 plus one time, one of the contracts earlier this week at 7 that we've come down some with that. So in fact, what's been an issue in the wheat market has been not just hard red winter wheat alone, but hard red winter wheat futures traded against soft red winter wheat, and the general fears of damage to the hard red crop relative to fairly stable soft red crop, actually widening spreads between those two, spreads between the Kansas hard red versus soft red or Chicago wheat. And of course, Chicago wheat can be delivered with all these classes, but the main class that they're delivering is soft red. So we're seeing that spread that's surely expressing itself. When you look at the corn futures, corn had also had some strength this week. We had some strong ongoing exports again. We're basically, for this week, we're up to 81 million bushels for a weekly trade. We need 65, 68 with USDA's lofty record high projection of 3.3 billion bushels. So that's showing strong market support. We don't have a lot of we don't have signals that we see much weakness in ethanol usage. So the demand side for corn, for feed grains, is holding it pretty well. Also had a decent export week, another decent export week for grain sorghum. I think about 5.5 million bushels, need about 4.5, 4.7 meet the USDA's goal. So both corn and grain sorghum holding up pretty well. And again, closed, I think I said this earlier, 467 and a quarter on Thursday for corn futures. Again, both sorghum and corn priced off of that. New crop bids at 488 and a half. And that was down about 1.25 cents. So we've been hovering in the again 4.90, looking towards $5 for new crop D's corn, and it probably very likely, depending on the basis bids available for taking forward contracts, offering some pricing opportunities for farmers, for Kansas farmers, as we've been seeing markets move around the last week or so. So interesting to watch. Soybean futures also having some carryover impact from all this happening in the wheat in the wheat complex. Seen July on Thursday, the 7th, closed at 11.91. New crop November 11.71 3/4. Generally, unless I'm just not seeing the reports, not hearing of major problems out of Brazil. You'll hear a limiting report followed by a better report, etc. So generally not in anything catastrophic there that's slowing down expectations of really a pretty decent crop. So you got all that happening. I would say when you look at the cash markets, that for corn, the highest bids in the state, and against one or two individual bids, highest bid in the state actually was Pittsburgh, Kansas, down southeast. That's upfront spot cash price, $4.58. New crop bid of $4.70. Second highest in the state. The highest new crop bid for corn is where you'd expect it to be historically, would be in the Garden City area, southwest Kansas, where feedlots and ethanol plants are. $4.80 for a new crop bid. Actual cash bid $4.33. So it's interesting of late, this dichotomy we have going on between, again, who's leading the state in terms of corn prices. It's either southeast Kansas with some of their pressures coming from pulling grain largely probably towards poultry and other livestock feeding southeast, versus what we see for beef feeding here in western Kansas. And other new crop bids also looking pretty decent as well. Again, Colby 452 for new crop forward contract, 445. Salina, Topeka at 450. But again, when you start seeing new crop bids getting close to 5, that gets everybody's attention out here in the West. And for sorghum, we see new crop bids highest cash bids in Hutchinson at $4.13, Topeka at $4.08. Other bids decent, especially Salina 393. So better bids for sorghum than we'd had for sure than earlier in the spot market. And new crop bids, really the top new crop bids in almost every part of the state except southeast Kansas, all at $4 or above. So quite a time really to look at new crop pricing opportunities as we've seen some of these issues come into play. So we just talked to feed grains, and again, the words on the lips of people in the feed grain side is the cost of fertilizer and how that's probably impacting on the margin acreage decisions. And we won't have evidence of that until the end of June with that acreage report. So right now the expectations are entrenched really that we'll see less corn acres at least than what had been projected at the end of March. Was about 40, I think it was 95 million acres or something along those lines. Anyway, I should give, as a representative of Kansas State, I should give a more solid number than that. The actual number for acres, yes, it was 95.4 million acres projected in that report. Again, fertilizer price on the high side is kind of determined the narrative that will plant less than that. And we'll see that the market the market guesses coming into that last report were about 1 million less than actually came about. And the other side of that corn is for soybeans. So we're expecting acreage to come out of the feed grains into soybeans. I think when we look, if that actually happens, the balance sheets that we have, and we end up at say 84, 85 or more million acres planted for soybeans. And if we have full decent yields, we're going to grow a lot of soybeans this year in the U.S. and that'll have market repercussions out in the fall of 2024. So I guess that's the way things go. And with our expectations now of cutting back corn acres, we're probably seeing an opposite outcome in the fall if this comes to fruition. Tighter corn corn stalks and higher prices than we'd have otherwise, and soybeans just the other side, of course, and that's assuming South American crops hold up decently. I should also add in for as we look at actual cash soybean prices, they're all the top prices are all running at about 11 to 1109, and that's the case at Salina, Hutchinson, Topeka, Pittsburgh, about 1050 to 1080 out in the western third of the state. So wheat harvest just around the corner. New crop bids with what we've had here in some of these scares. You've got a 654 in Topeka, 648 Hutchinson, 643 Salina, 590, 597 in Colby, Garden City, 591 in Pittsburgh. It's a conundrum. We're unsure what we're going to have for actual bushels received, yet these are some of the best forward contract prices for wheat that we've had in a while. So it puts a difficult decision in farmers' hands, but yet for prices, we've got some pretty good prices right now. Going forward, we'll be watching planting reports. We'll be watching moisture accumulations. Hopefully, no more freeze risks, and then seeing where the markets go. Most analysts, when you look at what they're watching for the markets, they're paying as much attention to the Straits of Hormuz and international political pressures and oil markets, fertilizer markets, as much as we are growing conditions right now for crops in the U.S. So, given the uncertainty with regard to all that's happening in the energy markets centered in the Middle East, it's just a very volatile time, very uncertain. So right now, I guess with all that uncertainty, we're reaping the positive side of uncertainty with a bit higher prices. But volatility can surely bring a downside later on. So it's just a very uncertain time in the grain markets.
Daniel, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby. I appreciate it.
That was K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing soil and crop conditions for corn and soybeans with K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan. Tina, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Tina, today, as we're talking about wet conditions for crops, and we are well aware this is not for all of the state, but as we're talking about this, first for people who maybe planted into wet soils, any concerns?
Yeah, when we're planting into wet soils, it's not just a logistics issue of maybe equipment getting stuck or something along those lines, but the reality is if we plant into wet soils, we can have what's referred to as sidewall and seed zone compaction. If we think about whether it's a drill or even just a regular planter, we have the knives, the wheels that spread the soil, plant the seed, and it's supposed to fall back, right? Well, we kind of think about wet soils, the dynamics of those soils start to change, especially if we're in a high clay concentration. So in those clays, they might not fully seal back correctly in some situations. So then there's kind of some weird seed to soil contact. But in other times, the compaction that's caused by that downward wheel pressure from planting can cause then the roots emerging from that seed to grow a little wonky. Sometimes they can grow out of it, sometimes they don't, which then can lead into later in the season issues, right? If the roots only go a couple inches down because there's this kind of compaction layer from planting, well, we can only go a few inches deep. Once the water runs out of there, what's the crop going to use? Especially if we're not getting pretty consistent rains. So kind of the way you can't really solve this problem if you've planted when it is wet, the best option is just wait until it is dry or drier to go into a field.
Is this something growers can go check in their field, though, to see if this is an issue?
So, and to see if your soil is dry enough to go plant, an easy way to kind of look at this is just dig down into where the planting depth you're wanting to do and make a ball of soil. If the ball crumbles or cracks, it's probably good to go. But if it is kind of more moldy, like it's still like clay, it's still probably too wet and you don't want to plant into that. So we're thinking like corn, go to 2 inches, grab some of that soil, If it balls up and doesn't crumble, it's too wet.
While we are thinking about corn, for people who already have had it planted and it's starting to come up and emerge, with all this rain we've gotten, is it potential to have been waterlogged or drowned out?
Absolutely. Anytime we have too much water saturating an area, whether it is standing water or just soils that maybe are slower to percolate that water out of the profile, we can see corn kind of look a bit yellow. It will look like a nutrient deficiency. Why? Well, the plants are waterlogged. They cannot actually breathe when the soil pores are full of water. So they need to uptake air from their roots. If everything is full of water, they can't breathe super well. So it's just waiting for that moisture to really just percolate through that soil profile. Also, in those situations, if there was high rain amounts like we saw in some parts of the state, we can sadly lose some of our nutrients. Thinking about nitrogen, if it leaches a little too much, deeper than where the roots are at that moment, it still will probably be bioavailable once the roots get there. Or if something like phosphorus, potassium in those high runoff events, think about some of those areas that got 4 to 6 inches of rain. If you lose any kind of soil, there's a potential of losing phosphorus, potassium because it's attached to the soil colloids itself.
Similar concerns then for corn and soybeans on that?
Correct. It doesn't really matter which crop it is, right? There's still opportunities to lose those very expensive fertility inputs in these high rain situations. And again, we cannot control how much rain we get in some of these storms, right? I know probably Western Kansas wishes we could package up some of this water and ship it over to them. But kind of thinking from a disease potential real quick, whether it's corn or soybean, there is a disease potential for either of them. Yes, the seeds have a seed coat on them that's typically a type of fungal protection. That protection only lasts for so long, kind of depending on how wet the soil's been, how cool the soil's been. Last year, we kind of had a wet time after some soybean planting, and it got cool, kind of like what we're seeing this year. And then later in the season, we saw kind of the Pythium and the Phytophthora issues. Am I going to say it's going to happen again this year? It really does depend, right? Pythium, Phytophthora, those soil-borne diseases, whether it's for corn or soybean, are naturally in the soil. You can't get rid of them, right? It's just the kind of the equation of duration of seed being saturated or seedling being saturated in this wet. Then the temperatures, is it cool for a certain amount of time or did it warm back up? What's the soil temperature? And then what was the presence of that inoculum or the disease in that soil at that time? So lots of moving pieces in this. Am I saying you're going to lose everything? Likely not. Just to be aware, it was wet here in May. What could come down later on into the season? Always when you're looking at your stand, especially if it was something just emerging or still not emerged when all this water came in, always evaluate your stand. You want to make sure you have a proper amount of stand. Corn is not going to be able to fill out like soybean can. So just being aware of what plants are there before we lose that opportunity to replant if it made sense.
Do you see that crop truly usually bounce back and start looking like a normal crop though again?
Most of the time we're going to see it bounce back, right? If it was stuck underwater for a week to 2 weeks, whether it's corn or soybean, the likeliness of those seeds rotting out does increase, right? Or ducks or birds kind of coming and picking them out. I was driving in Rossville earlier this week and I just saw ducks in the areas that were clearly the water had come out of every bank and they're just picking the corn out. But overall, across the east, we should be okay. Think about southeast Kansas and these kind of high rain events. We're kind of used to it in the southeast. We will have some stand loss. And that's where it's always looking back at what your insurance says or what coverage you have, and is it going to make sense for plant back?
You've mentioned clay soils a few times, so really more of a concern just for more clay soils and not maybe sandier soils?
When we think about those soil structures, right, whether it's a more sandy base or a more clayey base, clay holds on to water a lot more. It tends to have more issues with percolation or movement in that soil profile because clay particles are itty bitty. They stick together, and that's why clay holds on to water as tight as it does. And then when it doesn't have water, it turns into a brick. Whereas sand are bigger particles, so there's a lot more space between them. So the leaching or percolation of sands tends to be more than clay. So if it's more of a sandy soil, think about the Kansas River bottom areas. Yes, they had a lot of water, and a lot of those fields, they've dried out because there's enough sand in them. It could just percolate on through that soil profile and we can get back into the field. Whereas, depending on how close you are to some water bodies, it could be still a little outside of banks, so to speak. And also thinking about that topography of a field, right? Low spots, or if there's an area that's kind of been known for compaction of that soil, maybe due to traffic or something like that, equipment sitting there, you may see water hang out in those areas a bit longer because the water just can't penetrate through as well.
Any herbicide considerations?
Yes. So when it comes to herbicides, we have seen some damage to soybeans. Is it in kind of some isolated situations? Yes. Kind of thinking about, is it going to happen to every field of soybeans that were planted X amount of days before the big rain that always used said herbicide? No. There is a lot of moving pieces, thinking of it as like some large math equation, right? Did you plant X days? How pre or post was that herbicide application? And how close was that rain to both of those pieces of the puzzle? And what was the amount of rain? Situation that kind of brought it up into the e-update. I got called to a field. Every field this one farmer had, because he followed the same procedure, certain herbicide mix, certain planting date, and then he got 4.5 inches of rain. So pretty much every field of his showed the very similar uniform symptoms of herbicide damage to these seedlings, right? So we don't want to say it's going to be in every situation. Not saying it's an isolated to a hybrid or a company or a certain herbicide. It's more just a combination of what were the pre or post, what was the planting, was it emerging, is it emerged, and then the amount of rain. Because sometimes in this one field, we did see the water pooled on the one side of the field, and that's where we saw a lot of damage. Kind of think about water soaking into the seeds, maybe keeping that herbicide with it. It did cause a pretty substantial issue there. So just kind of keeping in mind, if you start seeing symptomologies, think back in time to what was the herbicide program, what was the planting protocol, right? If it's something super uniform, it's likely not disease, right? Disease shouldn't take out an entire field, whether it's corn or soybean. So just kind of thinking through what these symptoms can mean. If it's a plant that's yellowing or purpling, whether it's corn or soybeans, that's typically showing some early signs of nutrient deficiency. Yellowing typically being nitrogen, purpling typically being phosphorus, especially in that cold snap we had. They'll grow out of it.
That was K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, when we look at this past week, what were we seeing in terms of drought and precipitation?
Yeah, we finally got some much needed moisture in portions of the western Kansas. It's been a long time coming, and it was much anticipated. And thankfully, Mother Nature didn't really let us down. We ended up with as much as an inch or more precipitation, basically from the Finney County region westward to Hamilton County and northward. That entire region got at least 3/4 of an inch to an inch of precipitation. I say precipitation because, well, some of that fell as snow. We had up to an inch of snow along the Colorado border, and, not abnormal. We can see snow in May. It's just pretty rare. So southwest, south of that Finney to Hamilton County line, they did get some moisture, enough to say that they measured moisture, but most folks had less than a 1/4 inch, and we could really still use some precipitation. And I'd be remiss not to mention we did have a band of storms that did persist in east central. It kind of trailed eastward from that moisture that was in western Kansas. And there were some isolated areas of an inch around Ottawa and into Miami County, but it was pretty localized. So when we look at departure from normal on a weekly basis, the folks in the western part of the state had about 0.3 to 0.4 of an inch above normal, but our average precipitation is increasing, and they're averaging anywhere from around 0.4 to 0.5 inches of moisture a week in western Kansas. So that's enough for about 2 weeks. Whereas eastern Kansas, central Kansas, who missed out on a lot of this moisture, they averaged more precipitation, as much as nearly 2 inches in the far southeast and an inch for everyone else in central and northeast Kansas. That unfortunately developed a bigger deficit of precipitation, and so the drought monitor did do some expansion this week. We now have 40% of the state in at least D2 of moderate drought or worse, with about 5% in extreme. A new area of extreme was added in central Kansas as well. So while the moisture was needed, it's a drop in the bucket. We need continued precipitation and timely precipitation for everyone.
And what temperatures did we see paired with this precipitation?
Well, we had some snow in western Kansas, and that means temperatures were at or around freezing. We kind of were riding a roller coaster here. We had temperatures in western Kansas around Goodland down to as low as 28 degrees over the weekend. Then we saw temperatures surge back up to almost near 90, and they fell back down again into the upper 20s here on a Thursday morning. I think, when we look at this temperature roller coaster, I think things are going to start to level out more towards average as we move into the future. Both the Climate Prediction Center and the models all agree that we're going to start to see warmer temperatures more towards the 80-degree mark almost daily, and lows struggling to get down below 50 and maybe even below 60 some nights as we start to get the influence of high pressure that's been building to our west in southwestern United States. And that's going to shift north and east into the region and bring us overall kind of quieter weather. We're not going to see widespread precipitation. I still think we'll see scattered storms, but widespread precipitation is not as likely. And with that less moisture, we're going to see temperatures definitely trend a little warmer with that high pressure starting to impact our region as we go through the weekend and into early next week. Again, can't rule out some isolated storms, but for the most part, I think a lot of folks stay dry.
Chip, you mentioned temperatures being around freezing where we did have our last snow. And so do you think that means we've had our last official freeze?
That's a great question. And when we look at the average temperatures this time of year, we can get freezes pretty late into May, especially for northwest Kansas and southeast Kansas. They're already anywhere from 40 to 50 days since the last freezing temperature. I think they're pretty solidly beyond their last freeze. However, western Kansas, we've seen multiple freezes in the last week. We could have freezes pretty late into the season. This is very likely our final freeze for them. And I think temperatures are going to be warmer from here on out. And we just don't have the really cold air to work with anymore. It's shifted so far north, and we're really getting influence from southern origins more frequently now that it's just hard to get that cold air to drop temperatures below freezing.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.